The satellite feed cut out at 3:47 hours, and when it flickered back 13 minutes later, the jungle canopy showed no movement. No thermal signatures, no radio chatter, just the dense green silence of the Sumatran rainforest swallowing whatever had happened in that valley. At Langley, three analysts stared at blank screens while a four-star general named Mark stood behind them, arms crossed, jaw tight. The SEALs had gone in clean, 8 operators, textbook insertion. Target was a warlord's compound buried so deep in the interior that even the locals spoke of it in whispers. The mission was supposed to be 12 hours, in and out, before the monsoon rolled in. But now it was hour 19, and the only thing coming through the comms was static that sounded almost like breathing. Marks didn't move, didn't blink. He'd sent men into worse and gotten them back, but something about this silence felt different, felt wrong. The jungle wasn't supposed to be this quiet. Even the birds should have been screaming. Then at hour 22, a single transmission broke through. Not words, just a rhythmic tapping, Morse code, SOS, then nothing again. That's when they called her. Captain Delara, Phantom. Naveen was in the ready room at Anderson Air Force Base, Guam, playing cards with her weapons officer when the alert came through. She didn't flinch when the klaxon sounded. Just set down her hand, 3 queens, and walked toward the briefing room with the kind of calm that made the younger pilots nervous. She'd been flying combat missions for 11 years, most of them in aircraft that officially didn't exist, over countries the United States officially wasn't operating in. Her call sign wasn't ironic. She'd earned it the hard way, slipping through radar nets that should have lit her up like a Christmas tree, delivering ordnance so precise that enemy commanders thought they were being hunted by ghosts. But she was also a woman in a community that still whispered about whether she'd really earned her wings or just checked a box. The kind of whispers that stopped when she entered a room but resumed the second she left. She knew. She always knew. The briefing was short. 8 SEALs. No comms. Last known position deep in hostile territory. Weather window closing in 4 hours. The terrain was too dense for standard extraction. Too hot for a full strike package. They needed someone who could thread the needle, get in low, and pull them out before the jungle or the warlord's reinforcements finished the job. Someone expendable enough that if it went wrong, the headlines wouldn't be too loud. They didn't say that last part. They didn't have to. Phantom looked at the satellite images, the terrain maps, the shrinking weather window. Then she looked up at the colonel running the briefing and said, "I'll need a combat Talon and a pilot who won't flinch." The colonel hesitated. "You sure you want to do this?" She was already walking toward the flight line. The MC-130J Combat Talon II was a beast of an aircraft, designed for low-altitude penetration into denied territory, and the pilot they'd assigned to fly it, a major named Kowalski with a reputation for threading canyons at 200 feet, was waiting by the ramp when Phantom arrived. He looked her up and down once, then nodded. No questions, no comments, just professionalism, which was more than she usually got. Her weapons officer, Lieutenant Risa Chen, was already running pre-flight checks, her hands moving over the systems with the kind of muscle memory that came from 1,000 missions. They didn't talk much. Didn't need to. The mission brief had told them everything. Fly nap of the Earth through a mountain pass, drop into the valley under the weather, locate 8 SEALs somewhere in 40 square kilometers of jungle, and extract them before the storm made it impossible. Simple, except nothing about this was simple. The Combat Talon's engine spooled up with a sound like rolling thunder, and Phantom strapped into the right seat of the cockpit, her flight suit already damp with humidity. Kowalski ran through the checklist with mechanical precision, and within minutes they were wheels up, climbing into the bruised sky over the Pacific. The weather front was moving faster than predicted, a solid wall of purple-black clouds that looked like the sky was trying to swallow the ocean. They had 3 hours, maybe less. Phantom watched the horizon and felt the familiar weight settle into her chest, the weight of knowing that somewhere down there, 8 men were counting on her to be exactly as good as she'd always claimed to be. No margin for error. No room for doubt. Just the mission and the machine and the choice she'd made 11 years ago to be the person they called when no one else could do it. Kowalski glanced at her once as they leveled off. You really think they're still alive? She didn't answer immediately, just stared at the jungle sprawling endlessly below, the canopy so thick it looked like a solid surface. Then she said, they went quiet for a reason. Seals don't go quiet unless they're hunting or hiding. Either way, we find them. He nodded and pushed the throttles forward. The descent into the valley was like threading a needle in a hurricane. The combat Talon shuddered as Kowalski brought them down through the mountain pass, the peaks rising on either side like jagged teeth, the airframe rattling as crosswinds tried to shove them into the rock faces. Phantom's hands hovered over her controls, ready to take over if Kowalski faltered, but he didn't. He flew with the kind of cold precision that made her respect him, carving a path through the turbulence that should have been impossible. 200 feet, 100. The jungle canopy rushed up to meet them, and then they were skimming the treetops, the roar of the engines swallowed by the density of the rainforest. 30 seconds to drop zone, Kowalski said, his voice steady. Phantom keyed her radio. Phantom to any Bravo element, we are inbound to your last known position. If you can hear this, mark your location. Static, just static and the howl of the wind. She tried again. Bravo element, this is Phantom. We are your ride home, give us something. Still nothing. Her jaw tightened. They were flying blind now, searching for heat signatures in a jungle that was almost body temperature, looking for men who might already be dead. Then Risa's voice crackled through the intercom. I've got something. Infrared signature, grid November 742. Faint, but it's there. Phantom looked at the coordinates. Deep in the thickest part of the jungle, 2 kilometers from the compound, she made the call. Kowalski, come left to heading 270, take us in. He didn't argue, just banked the massive aircraft like it was a fighter jet, the wings nearly clipping the canopy as they carved through the sky. The jungle blurred beneath them, and Phantom felt her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear, but from the sharpness of the moment, the way everything narrowed down to this. The mission, the men, the promise she'd made to herself that she would never leave anyone behind. Contact, Risa said. I see them, 8 figures clustered, they're not moving. Phantom's blood went cold, not moving at all. No, wait, one just waved, they're alive. The relief was like a punch to the chest, but Phantom didn't let it show. She keyed the radio again. Bravo element, we have visual, prepare for extraction. We're coming in hot. Kowalski brought the combat Talon into a hover that the aircraft wasn't designed for, the engine screaming in protest as the ramp dropped, and the jungle wind howled into the cargo bay. Phantom could see them now through the rear camera, 8 figures in tattered gear, faces smeared with mud and blood, rifles still in their hands. They moved like wounded animals, fast but limping, dragging each other toward the ramp as the downwash from the rotors flattened the vegetation around them. 30 seconds, Kowalski said. We've got company. I'm picking up vehicles, 2 kilometers north and closing fast. Phantom didn't hesitate. Get them on board now. The SEALs stumbled up the ramp and Phantom counted each one as they collapsed into the cargo bay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all accounted for, all breathing, some barely. Ramp up, go, 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 she shouted, and Kowalski didn't need to be told twice. The combat Talon lurched forward, engines howling as they clawed for altitude, the jungle canopy whipping past so close that Phantom could see individual leaves. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, muzzle flashes like angry fireflies. But Kowalski was already banking hard, climbing through the narrow corridor between the mountains, the airframe shuddering with every gust of wind. They cleared the pass with maybe 10 feet to spare. Phantom finally allowed herself to breathe. She turned in her seat and looked back at the cargo bay, where the SEALs were slumped against the bulkheads, bloodied and exhausted but alive. One of them, a lieutenant with a face like granite and eyes that had seen too much, met her gaze and nodded once. No words, just respect. She nodded back. The flight back to Guam was 3 hours of tense silence. The SEALs didn't talk much, and when they did, it was in the clipped shorthand of men who just survived something they shouldn't have. Phantom stayed in the cockpit, monitoring the radios, listening to the storm chase them across the ocean. Kowalski flew with the same unshakable calm, and when they finally touched down at Anderson, the wheels kissing the tarmac like a prayer answered, she realized her hands were trembling. Just a little. Just enough that she knew the mission had cost her something, even if she didn't know what yet. The SEALs were taken to medical, and Phantom filed her after-action report in the operations center, her words sparse and factual. The colonel who'd briefed her earlier read it, then looked up at her with something that might have been surprise. "You pulled off something most pilots couldn't," he said. "Hell of a job, Captain." She didn't smile, just saluted and walked out. But as she left the building, she heard voices behind her, younger pilots, the ones who'd whispered before. They weren't whispering now. They were talking about the mission, about how she'd threaded an impossible extraction, about how the SEALs were calling her the Phantom for real now, not just as a call sign but as a title. She didn't stop to listen. Didn't need to. She'd proven what she'd always known, that she belonged in the cockpit, that her wings weren't a gift. They were earned, in blood and storm and the silent weight of bringing people home. But the mission wasn't over, not really. 3 days later, Phantom was called into a secure briefing room at Anderson. The same colonel was there, along with a CIA officer she didn't recognize and one of the SEALs she'd extracted, the lieutenant with the granite face. His name, she learned, was Briggs. He looked better than he had in the jungle, but there was still a haunted edge to his eyes, the kind that came from seeing things you couldn't unsee. "Captain Naveen," the colonel began, "the mission you flew wasn't just an extraction. It was the opening move in something bigger." She waited, said nothing. The CIA officer leaned forward. "The warlord you pulled Lieutenant Briggs and his team away from. His name is Qasim Armin. He's not just running guns and drugs through Southeast Asia. He's brokering deals with state actors, North Korea, Iran, possibly China. We've been tracking him for 2 years, but he's always 3 steps ahead. The compound your team hit was supposed to give us leverage. Instead, it gave us a body count and 8 survivors who saw something they weren't supposed to see." Briggs spoke for the first time, his voice low and rough. "We found a bunker under the compound, communications hub, satellite uplinks, encryption gear that shouldn't exist outside a government facility, and a manifest, shipping routes, dates, destinations. Whatever Armin's planning, it's big, and it's happening in the next 2 weeks. Phantom felt the weight of it settling over her. "And you need someone to go back." The colonel nodded. "We need someone who can get in undetected, gather intel, and get out before Armin realizes we're onto him. Someone who's already proven they can operate in that terrain." She looked at Briggs. "Your team." "We're going back," he said, "but we need air support. Someone who can cover our exfil if things go sideways again." Phantom considered it. The smart move was to say no, to let someone else take the risk, but she'd never been good at the smart move. "When do we leave?" she asked. The mission planning took 36 hours. Phantom worked with Briggs and his team, going over satellite imagery, infiltration routes, contingency plans. The warlord's compound was on high alert now, reinforced with additional security, and the jungle around it was crawling with patrols. Getting in would be hard. Getting out would be harder. But Briggs and his SEALs moved with the kind of quiet confidence that came from being the best at what they did, and Phantom found herself respecting them more with every passing hour. They didn't question her presence, didn't make jokes or comments, just treated her like what she was, the person who'd keep them alive when the bullets started flying. The night before the mission, she found Briggs alone in the hangar, checking his gear with the meticulous care of a man who knew that a loose strap could mean death. She approached slowly, hands in her pockets, and he glanced up. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He shook his head. "Never can before something like this. You. Same. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant hum of generators and the rustle of palm trees in the night breeze. Then Briggs said, I never thanked you for what you did, getting us out of there. You don't have to. Yeah, I do. He paused, choosing his words carefully. A lot of pilots would have turned around, said the weather was too bad, the risk too high. You didn't. You came for us anyway, that means something. Phantom looked at him, saw the sincerity in his eyes and felt something crack open in her chest, a small, fragile thing she'd kept locked away for years. I made a promise a long time ago, she said quietly, that I'd never leave anyone behind, no matter what. Why? She hesitated, then because he'd earned the right to know, she told him. My first deployment, I was part of a rescue mission. Another pilot went down in hostile territory and we were tasked with pulling him out, but the mission commander called it off, said it was too dangerous, too many unknowns. We left him there. Her voice hardened. He died 3 days later, alone, and I swore I'd never let that happen again, never let someone die because I was too afraid to try. Briggs nodded slowly. That's why they call you Phantom. You're the one who shows up when everyone else has given up. She didn't respond, didn't need to. The next morning, they launched before dawn. The infiltration was textbook. Briggs and his team fast-roped into the jungle from a hovering Black Hawk while Phantom orbited overhead in an AC-130 gunship, her weapons systems hot and ready. The plan was simple. The SEALs would move through the jungle, breach the compound, retrieve the intelligence, and exfil to a secondary extraction point 5 kilometers south. Phantom would provide overwatch, scanning for threats, ready to rain fire if things went wrong. It was the kind of mission that relied on speed, precision, and a little bit of luck. For the first 2 hours, everything went according to plan. Briggs and his team moved like shadows through the jungle, bypassing patrols, avoiding sensors, closing in on the compound with methodical efficiency. Phantom tracked their progress through thermal imaging, her eyes never leaving the screen, her finger resting lightly on the trigger of the gunship's 105 howitzer. The jungle was alive with heat signatures, animals, patrols, the ambient warmth of the rainforest itself. But her team was invisible, blending into the chaos with the skill that made them legendary. Then, at hour 2 and 37 minutes, everything went to hell. Contact, contact. Briggs's voice exploded over the radio, and Phantom's screen lit up with muzzle flashes. Dozens of them. The compound security had been waiting, and now the SEALs were pinned down in a kill box, taking fire from 3 directions. She could see them on the thermal display, 8 figures hunkered behind cover returning fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Phantom, we need fire support, grid November 758. Briggs shouted, his voice tight with urgency. Phantom was already moving, her hands flying over the controls as she brought the AC-130 into position. The gunship's sensors locked onto the coordinates, and she saw them. Enemy fighters pouring out of the compound, spreading out to flank the SEALs. She keyed her mic. Bravo element, danger close. Get your heads down. She didn't wait for confirmation, just squeezed the trigger. The 105 howitzer roared, and the jungle erupted in fire. The first round landed dead center in the enemy formation, the explosion tearing through the trees and sending bodies flying. The second round hit the compound's eastern gate, collapsing it in a shower of concrete and twisted metal. The third, fourth, and fifth rounds walked across the enemy positions with surgical precision, each one a hammer blow that shattered the warlord's defenses. Phantom fired with the calm detachment of someone who'd done this 100 times, her mind calculating trajectories, adjusting for wind, compensating for the gunship's movement. She was in the zone now, that place where time slowed and the world narrowed to the crosshairs and the target. Phantom, you're a goddamn artist, Briggs shouted over the radio, and she almost smiled. Moving to secondary exfil point, he continued. We've got the intel, get us out of here. Phantom banked the gunship and followed them through the jungle, her eyes scanning for more threats. The warlord's forces were in disarray now, but they wouldn't stay that way for long. She had maybe 10 minutes before reinforcements arrived, and the storm was closing in fast, the sky darkening with bruised clouds that promised violence. "Exfil bird inbound, ETA 8 minutes," she said. "Hold position and stay low." The SEALs reached the extraction point and formed a defensive perimeter, and Phantom held overwatch, her weapons trained on the jungle around them. The minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last, and she could feel the tension coiling in her chest. Then finally, the Black Hawk appeared on the horizon, skimming low over the treetops, and the SEALs were moving, loading onto the helo with practiced speed. "We're up," Briggs said. "Thanks for the cover." "Any time," Phantom replied, and she meant it. But as the Black Hawk lifted off and the SEALs disappeared into the storm, Phantom stayed on station, circling the compound, watching, because something felt wrong. The warlord's forces had collapsed too easily, and she'd learned a long time ago that easy victories were usually traps. She scanned the thermal display looking for anomalies, and that's when she saw it. A convoy of vehicles moving fast through the jungle, heading south toward the exfil point. Heading toward Briggs. Her blood ran cold. "Bravo Element, you've got company," she said, her voice sharp. "Hostile convoy, 6 vehicles moving to intercept." Briggs's response was immediate. "Can you stop them?" Phantom looked at the fuel gauge, the weapons readout, the shrinking weather window. She had maybe 2 passes before she'd have to break off and head back to base. Maybe less if the storm hit. But if she didn't stop that convoy, Briggs and his team wouldn't make it out. "Yeah," she said, "I can stop them." She dove. The AC-130 screamed toward the convoy, and Phantom's world contracted to the gun sight and the trigger. She fired the 105 howitzer first, the round slamming into the lead vehicle and flipping it end over end, the explosion lighting up the jungle like a second sun. The convoy scattered, vehicles peeling off in different directions, trying to avoid the fire, but Phantom was relentless. She switched to the 40 Bofors cannon and walked it across the convoy, each burst chewing through armor and flesh, the jungle erupting in flames and smoke. One vehicle tried to make a run for it, accelerating toward the exfil point, but she put a 105 round right through its engine block and watched it cartwheel into the trees. The last vehicle stopped, just stopped, and for a moment Phantom thought they were surrendering. Then the roof hatch opened and she saw the distinctive shape of a surface-to-air missile launcher. "Oh hell," she muttered, and yanked the gunship into a hard turn, deploying flares and chaff as the missile launched with a trail of white smoke. The proximity alarm screamed in her headset, and she felt the gunship shudder as the missile detonated close enough to rattle the airframe. Alarms blared. Red lights flashed across the console. The right engine was losing power, and the hydraulics were reading critical. "Phantom, you're hit," Kowalski's voice crackled over the radio. He'd been flying escort in an F-16, and now she could see him streaking past, his jet a silver blur against the darkening sky. "I'm fine," she said, even though she wasn't. The gunship was losing altitude, the controls sluggish, and the storm was closing in fast. She had maybe 5 minutes before the aircraft became unflyable. But the convoy was stopped, the threat neutralized, and Briggs and his team were clear. That was what mattered. "Heading back to base," she said, her voice steady even as her hands fought the controls. "Kowalski, stay on me." "Copy that, I've got your 6. The flight back was a nightmare. The gunship shook with every gust of wind, the damaged engine coughing and sputtering, and Phantom flew on instinct and sheer will, coaxing the dying aircraft through the storm. The coast appeared like a lifeline, and she aimed for Anderson, praying the runway would appear before the gunship gave up entirely. Kowalski stayed with her the whole way, his voice calm and reassuring over the radio, talking her through the descent. And when the wheels finally touched down and the gunship rolled to a stop on the tarmac, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She'd made it, they'd all made it. The debrief was short and brutal. The colonel congratulated them on the successful mission, the intelligence retrieved, the convoy destroyed. But his eyes kept drifting to the damaged gunship on the tarmac, and Phantom knew what he was thinking. She'd taken a risk that could have gotten her killed. She'd stayed on station when she should have pulled back. She'd put herself in danger to save 8 men who weren't even her responsibility. And she'd do it again in a heartbeat. Later, Briggs found her in the hangar, watching the maintenance crew assess the damage to her gunship. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, hands in his pockets, staring at the torn metal and scorched paint. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. "Go after the convoy. You were already low on fuel and the storm was moving in. You could have let us handle it." "You would have died," Phantom said simply. "Maybe, but you almost died too." She looked at him, saw the concern in his eyes, and felt something shift between them, a bond forged in fire and blood, the kind that couldn't be put into words. "That's the job," she said quietly. "We look out for each other, no matter what." Briggs nodded, then he held out his hand. "Thanks, Phantom, for everything." She shook it, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't alone. The weeks that followed were a blur of mission planning, intelligence analysis, and long nights in the operations center. The data Briggs and his team had retrieved from the compound was more valuable than anyone had anticipated. Shipping manifests, financial records, communications logs that tied Qasim Arman to a network of state-sponsored terror groups and rogue nations. The intelligence community was scrambling to piece it all together, and Phantom found herself pulled into meetings with people whose faces she'd only seen in classified briefings. Generals, admirals, cabinet officials. They all wanted to know the same thing. Could she do it again? Could she go back into hostile territory, extract targets, gather intelligence, and come out alive? She always said yes. Because that was who she was. The pilot they called when the mission was impossible. The one who showed up when everyone else had given up. The Phantom. But the missions were taking their toll. She could feel it in the ache of her shoulders, the exhaustion that settled into her bones after every flight, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. She was pushing herself harder than she ever had, and she knew it wasn't sustainable. Knew that eventually something would give. But she couldn't stop. Because every mission meant someone came home. Every flight meant someone's family didn't get that knock on the door. And that was worth everything. The final mission came 2 months later. Qasim Arman had been tracked to a remote island off the coast of the Philippines, a volcanic outcrop with a single airstrip and a fortress carved into the rock. He'd gone to ground, knowing the net was closing, and the intelligence community had decided it was time to end him. The mission was simple in theory, a precision strike to take out Arman and his command structure, followed by a raid to seize any remaining intelligence. But simple didn't mean easy. The island was heavily defended, surrounded by surface-to-air missile batteries and patrol boats, and the weather was turning again, another storm rolling in from the Pacific. They needed someone who could get the strike package in and out without being detected, someone who could fly through hell and bring everyone home. They called Phantom. She stood in the briefing room and looked at the satellite images of the island, the fortress, the defenses. It was a suicide mission. Everyone in the room knew it, but no one said it out loud. "What do you need?" the colonel asked. Phantom studied the images for a long moment. Then she said, "A strike package, 4 F-18s with precision munitions, a SEAL team for the raid, and air superiority. I don't want any surprises." "You'll have it," the colonel said, "whatever you need." She nodded. Then she looked around the room at the faces of the planners and analysts and decision-makers, and she saw it, the doubt. The unspoken question, could she really pull this off? Was she really that good? She smiled just a little. "I'll bring them home," she said. "I always do." The mission launched at 200 hours. Phantom flew lead in an F-18 Super Hornet, her call sign blazing across the tactical display, and behind her were 3 more fighters, their pilots hand-picked for their skill and nerve. Below them, the ocean stretched black and endless, and ahead, the island waited like a predator. They flew in radio silence, skimming low over the water, their radar profiles minimized, and Phantom felt the familiar focus settle over her, the clarity that came when everything else fell away and only the mission remained. 2 minutes to target, she said quietly, and the formation tightened, the fighters moving in perfect synchronization. The island appeared on the horizon, a dark shape against the darker sky, and Phantom's targeting systems locked onto the fortress. She could see the missile batteries now, the searchlights sweeping the sky, the patrol boats circling the island like sharks. "Weapons hot," she said. "Engage on my mark." She counted down in her head, 3, 2, 1. Mark! The fighters unleashed their payloads, precision-guided munitions screaming toward the fortress, and the night exploded in fire. The missile batteries died first, torn apart by the fury of the strike, and then the fortress itself erupted, the walls collapsing in a cascade of stone and flame. Phantom pulled up hard, her fighter climbing through the smoke and debris, and she keyed her radio. "Package delivered. SEAL team, you're clear." Below, the SEALs, Briggs and his team, fast-roped onto the island and moved toward the shattered fortress. Phantom circled overhead, her eyes scanning for threats, her weapons ready. The mission was almost over. Almost. Then the radar lit up. Contacts. Fighters. Armin had called in reinforcements, and now they were coming, 6 hostile aircraft screaming toward the island at supersonic speed. Phantom's pulse spiked, but her voice stayed calm. "We've got company, defensive formation. Protect the SEAL team." The dogfight was brutal and fast. The hostile fighters were good, better than she'd expected, but Phantom was better. She outmaneuvered them, outthought them, her fighter dancing through the sky like it was an extension of her will. She took down 2 fighters with missile shots, a third with her cannon, and when it was over and the sky was clear, she realized she was shaking. Not from fear, from the rush, from the knowledge that she'd just done the impossible. "Again." "Bravo element status," she said. "Mission complete," Briggs replied. "Armin's down, we're ready for exfil." Phantom exhaled. "Copy that, let's go home." The flight back to Anderson was quiet. The strike package regrouped over the ocean, and Phantom led them home through the dawn, the sun rising over the Pacific like a promise. When they landed, the entire base was waiting. Ground crews, pilots, officers, all of them standing on the tarmac in silent tribute. Because they knew. They all knew what she'd done. What she'd been doing for years. Briggs was waiting too. When she climbed out of the cockpit, he walked up to her, snapped a salute, and said, "You're a legend, Captain, thank you." She saluted back. "Just doing my job, Lieutenant." But as she walked away, she heard the cheers, loud and unrestrained, and for the first time in her career she let herself believe them. Believe that she'd earned her place, that she belonged, that she was more than just a name on a roster or a call sign on a radio. She was Phantom, and she'd proven over and over that she was exactly as good as they needed her to be. 2 weeks later, Phantom was called to Washington. She sat in a conference room in the Pentagon, surrounded by stars and flags and people whose decisions shaped the world, and they told her she was being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the Armin operation. They told her she was being promoted. They told her she was an inspiration. She listened politely, thanked them, accepted the medal, but inside she was already thinking about the next mission, the next pilot who would go down, the next team that would need extraction, because that was who she was, that was what she did. And when they asked her if she had anything to say, she stood up, looked them all in the eye, and said, "I made a promise a long time ago, that I'd never leave anyone behind. That promise doesn't end here. As long as there are people who need bringing home, I'll be there. That's what the wings mean. That's what the call sign means. And that's what I'll keep doing until I can't anymore." The room was silent. Then one by one the officers stood and applauded, not because they had to, but because they understood, because she'd shown them what it meant to be a pilot, to be a warrior, to be someone worth following. Phantom left the Pentagon that afternoon and flew back to Guam, back to her squadron, back to the flight line where her aircraft waited, patched up and ready for the next mission. She stood on the tarmac and looked up at the sky, at the endless blue that had been her home for so many years, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Because she knew, without a doubt, that she'd kept her promise, that the jungle had stayed quiet for hours, but every seal had emerged, bloodied and still breathing, because of her, because she'd refused to leave them behind. And that was enough. The jungle stayed quiet for hours, until every seal emerged, bloodied and still breathing, and the pilot who brought them home became the legend they would tell their children about. The Phantom, the one who showed up when no one else could, the one who proved that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being afraid and flying anyway, about making the hard call and living with the consequences, about promising to bring people home and keeping that promise, no matter the cost. And in the years that followed, when young pilots asked about her, when they wondered if the stories were true, the answer was always the same. Yes, every word, because she was there. And she did the impossible, because that's what legends do.